This podcast is brought to you with the help of small contributions donated by listeners like yourself. To see how you can support the show, go to www.podcast.com/support. For those who already support the show, keep listening. At the end, I have details of a free prize draw, and your name will be in the hat. Hello and welcome to another World War II podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. In this episode, we'll be looking at how Britain found the manpower to fight the war. By the end, at least 4.5 million had served from Britain, and if we add to that figure Empire and Commonwealth forces, we're looking at perhaps upwards of 10 million. It's an astounding figure. I'm joined by Roger Broad. Roger's new book, Volunteers and Pressed Men, looks at recruitment during both the First and Second World War in both Britain and its empire. Thanks for joining me. Shall we start by looking at the British Army? I guess the First World War set the pattern for the rapid expansion in 1939 onwards. Without picking over World War One, what lessons came out of that war?
It depends on what level. At the popular level, both in Britain and what by 1939 were known as the Dominions, the lesson which a very large number of people had learnt was to try and keep out of the army.
Yeah, well, presumably in a similar vein, the generals during World War II would have learnt from their First World War experience when they would have been junior officers, such as Montgomery, and will be mindful of casualties and the need to conserve the manpower and not waste it fruitlessly. Absolutely.
Now, in Britain, the conscription, of course, came in immediately in September 1939, and the provision of the Act had two important provisions. One was that men could opt for one of the three services, Army, Navy or Air Force, whereas in the First World War, really, there'd been no choice except the Army. And secondly, men could volunteer ahead of the time due according to their age group. So this had a very important effect, that it meant that a lot of people stepped forward ahead of their time, and it meant their choice was more likely to be respected. And throughout the war years, you had more people applying to join the Air Force and the Navy than the Army, although in numerical terms, something like 3/5 of the total armed services were in the Army, but not as many people as that volunteered. And so which meant that the Army, the Navy and the Air Force could pick and choose the best men they wanted, and it left the Army with probably the least educated, perhaps not always and often the physically less adequate, and if you like, the people who couldn't avoid anything else. So a lot of bright, able, healthy people joined the Air Force, and though of course if you were air crew, the fatality rate was extremely high, particularly in Bomber Command, something like nearly over 45, something about 45% overall. If you were in ground crew, RAF, you were pretty safe. Very few ground crew, in fact, were killed, though obviously when airfields were bombed, they did. The Navy was not quite so, but it meant that particularly after 1944, after D-Day, when the rate of casualties had been underestimated, and it was underestimated also by the Canadians and Americans, there was a very acute shortage of infantrymen. So that was a lesson, if you like, learnt at the popular level. Try and get in the Air Force or the Navy. It may not be very heroic, but it was a reality, and understandable when so many people had been, without doubt, needlessly sacrificed in Flanders.
They must at some point put their foot down and just said, look, enough's enough, we don't need any more for the RAF, you're all going into the Army.
Well, only in the summer of 1944, August 44, that's say a couple of months after D-Day, and the breakout from Normandy, of course, from the beachhead, took much longer than was expected. It took over 2 months. And, of course, it was 2.5 months after D-Day before Paris was liberated, for example. It was a very hard slog. The Germans, despite all the diversionary plans and so on, the Germans recovered remarkably quickly in their defence. And that's when you started having men being transferred out of the Navy and out of the Air Force in late summer, autumn of 44, and again the following year, early in 45. But it wasn't. It was something like 40 or 50,000 men, not an enormous number in the circumstances. In 44, there was a report within the Air Ministry saying that a lot of people, a lot of men are volunteering for aircrew and then deliberately failing their tests, whether they were gunners or pilots, which men then became ground crew, unless possibly they were amongst those who were transferred out to the army. The problem of aircrew morale, of course, was extremely acute in Bomber Command, with these very, very heavy losses.
So quite early in the war, we have a huge number of men. I think, is it 1.5 million men by sort of sometime in 1940 under arms? It's just an extraordinary figure. And I wonder if such a rapid expansion of the army ended up with a lot of square pegs in round holes.
Certainly at the early part of the war, the round pegs and the square holes were very obvious. But it was only really in by 41, 42, when proper selection of personnel and of officers was introduced under General Adam, who was the Adjutant General. That question of matching abilities to needs was in any way approached. It couldn't, of course, be an absolutely 100%, but it was greatly improved. And certainly in 1940, after Dunkirk, a very large number of men were called up to fill out 120 new battalions. And the army authorities objected to this, but Churchill insisted, because this has got to demonstrate not only to the British but to Americans and others that Britain was going to resist. And so you had this business of a very large number of men being called up for the army, really without equipment, without training facilities, and finding adequate training staff was very difficult. But gradually, as heavier weapons became available, artillery, tanks, and so on, a lot of these people who were pushed into the infantry in 1940 were then trained on for other arms as the equipment became available.
There must have been a lot of green officers with such an expansion of the army.
Oh, yes. Yeah, and the selection procedure for officers was basically, to a large degree, what it had been, or still even towards the end of the First World War, of the right sort of chap who'd been to the right sort of school and played the right sort of games. They wanted rugger players, not soccer players, in a sense, which meant all sorts of people whose parents had the money to send them, to private education, were assumed to be officer-like material, and they weren't, and they didn't want to become officers. There's a very good book by what's his name? The Recollections of Rifleman Dalby, is it? I can't remember, but he was
Rifleman Bowlby.
He was a public school boy who went into the one of the rifle regiments and absolutely refused to take a commission or put in for one. Which was deeply embarrassing for the officers, some of whom were certainly not necessarily been at school with him, but felt he was letting the class down. And he wrote this very informative and also entertaining book about life as a rifleman in Italy.
Was conscription popular in Britain? Had the public foreseen it coming?
Well, certainly during the 30s, both Baldwin and Chamberlain, when Prime Minister, said, no, there'll be no conscription in peacetime. And that was extremely popular, and it would have been very difficult politically to get it through, except after the Germans occupied the whole of Czechoslovakia in 1939. Chamberlain decided that they must bring in a conscription, not least to persuade the French that the British were being serious about resisting Germany. And he justified his change of total reversal of policy by saying, well, we're not at war, but we can't say that we're at peace either. And that's when, in May of 39, conscription came in for what was intended to be 6 months training in the what they call the revived militia. But by the time they'd got 34,000 men together in this militia in July 39, were only 6 weeks through their 6 months training before full conscription came in. And a lot of some of those, certainly, of those militiamen finished up in France in 1940 and spent the rest of the war as prisoners. And, of course, a lot of regulars and territorials as well. that we're aware of the 200,000 British and the 100,000 French who got away at Dunkirk. But there were something like 40,000 British and a great many more French who were either captured or killed in the 1940 campaign. The French losses were very considerable. The British sort of popular imagination thinks the French just threw in their hands. They didn't, extremely bravely and courageously against a far superior enemy.
So it's a wonderful image, cartoon image in the Evening Standard in June 1944 of the Tommy shaking his fist at the English Channel and shouting very well alone. But it's far from true, is it?
Absolutely. I think this is the British rather congratulating themselves. I mean, not only were there a lot of Poles, Czechs, and other Europeans in the Air Force in fighter command, but a lot of Commonwealth people, particularly New Zealanders, because the New Zealand Air Force was very small, and they'd sent a lot of people, as had the Australians, to Britain for training, and so they were available. About 1 in 5 of the Battle of Britain fighter pilots were non-UK. And of course, later in the war, I mean, the manpower in India, in Africa, was mobilized to a very high level, quite a highish level, and without the Commonwealth forces, Britain could not have continued, even though it took a long time for the war potential to be mobilized in the other parts of the Commonwealth and Empire. By the end of the war, Canada was, for example, particularly Canada, had industrialized to extraordinary, was producing bomber aircraft, Lancasters and Mosquitoes, and also tanks, other armored vehicles on a very high, quite a high level. Australia to perhaps a lesser extent. But then towards the end of the war, I mean, conscription had lots of problems outside Britain. There were, of course, quite a few conscientious objectors who in the Second World War were treated rather more respectfully, and they did quite useful work, not least as stretcher bearers, which was a far more risky job than many other fully trained soldiers were actually doing. But the New Zealanders had conscription without any problems. There were difficulties in Canada, largely with the French speakers who were unwilling or reluctant to take part in what they thought was not a Canadian war. South Africa, of course, with the Afrikaners, there was quite an element who were very pro-Nazi. And in Australia, there were the other problems of they had a long-standing tradition of not sending conscripts overseas, which was only volunteers should go overseas. And that caused problems once the Japanese were coming over the horizon in 1942. Where did home defence end? Some Australian conscripts did finish up in New Guinea and other parts of the South Pacific.
Why do you think some of these, I mean, certainly Canada and New Zealand can be singled out for almost backing Britain to the hilt, almost unconditionally. Why do you think it was?
I mean, initially, of course, all the Dominions were much more reluctant to fight than they had been in 1914. By 1939, like the British, or the French, or the Germans, for that matter, knew what was involved. And so had much less enthusiasm for joining up. And, when you're stuck, in the way in the middle of the Canadian prairies, well, Europe's a long way away. In Australia, of course, you had a long-standing tradition or sentiment of rebelliousness dating back to the transportation of convicts. In Australia, you've got this sort of authoritarian element in psychology and in the society, but also you've got this rebellious element, and that was, not wanting to be pushed around by, the boss class.
Did the British Army press, or the British military press, for the Empire forces to fall within the British Army umbrella, or the British military umbrella?
Yes, I think, and one of the complaints in both wars was that the British tended to look upon the if you like, the Dominion and the Indians and other, if you like, colonial forces as if they were part of the British Army. But even in the First World War, the Australians and Canadians in France had insisted they should have a Canadian corps and an Australian corps who would, although under overall British command, would nonetheless fight as a single Australian corps. And you had it to And that was taken, of course, that, if you like, lesson was learnt by the British High Command. And so in 1944, for example, I mean, indeed earlier, in the Second War, you had a Canadian army, the Second Canadian Army in Normandy and through northwest Europe. And the Australians at least had in the Western Desert. And New Zealanders had separate divisions. They were, resisting being incorporated into British, if you like, formations, though they often depended on British rear echelon support forces to keep the men in the front line supplied and reinforced.
Yeah, that was different for the RAF. They were all encompassed within the RAF. Is that right?
Well, in practice, yes, but in fact, you had, for example, both bomber command and fighter command in Europe, you had what were considered to be Australian squadrons or Canadian squadrons or New Zealand squadrons, but they weren't necessarily all Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders who served in those squadrons. You found a navigator or gunners or whatever it might be. You've had to fill in with the appropriate skill, whatever the origin. So you did have what were nominally Australian or nominally British squadrons had a mixture of personnel, as of course you'd had from the very start of the First World War, in the sense of having to put into the county regiments in England or in Scotland, you had to put in men, whatever their origin. So there were Yorkshiremen serving in the Wiltshire Regiment, for example, from a very early time. And as the war went on, the reinforcements became more and more varied in their geographical origin within the UK.
I find it curious that they push for their ground forces to be separate, yet they're seemingly happy for them to sort of fall under the RAF as the RAF.
They weren't necessarily happy because the Canadians in Bomber Command in particular, they thought that all pilots and navigators should be commissioned officers, whereas the British had sergeant pilots who was in command, and even if his navigator was was an officer, he was under the navigator officer was under the command of the pilot, and the Canadians pressed hard that all if you like the senior aircrew or the most skilled aircrew should be commissioned. Again, this was resisted by the British, by the RAF, which was much less prone to give commissions to people on a sort of, if you like, a class basis. Because whatever school you'd been to, if you couldn't fly a plane, you weren't any good. It was a much more demanding, a much more skilled standard amongst their officers who had to have a very considerable technical ability, which wasn't necessary so much in, say, the infantry or some of the army.
Had there been any discussion in the interwar years with the Empire on how, if a future conflict erupted, how they might recruit? I mean, presumably you'd only really need to talk to the Dominions because the rest of the Empire would sort of fall under direct London control.
Yes, I think the Dominions, even more than the British, after the end of the First World War, were told, we don't want anything more to do with that. We're finished. That's awful. We're forgetting it. And so there was very little and inadequate coordination, even at sort of staff level, with the Dominions, who let their own armed forces, dwindle back to a very small numbers. Whereas, of course, the British always had, in relative terms anyway, a biggish professional army, because it's the main job of the British Army, of course, was to police the Empire, and of course of the Navy too. That was a worldwide service, and so that there was a professional class of in the military, in the Navy and the Air Force, to a lesser extent the Air Force, of course, being a new arm. Then you had in Australia or Canada, where you had maybe a total regular army of 3,000 or 4,000 men. It was hardly, it wasn't much of a career channel to go to. And whereas and in the British Army, you could maybe get secondment to one of the colonial forces, or you could either permanently or on a seconded basis, perhaps go to India for some years.
I was going to ask about South Africa, because that's an interesting one, because obviously you mentioned already that it was sort of split in various ways. Certainly the white communities split between the Afrikaans and the sort of the British whites. Did they introduce any form of conscription? Because there was South African troops, certainly in North Africa, wasn't there?
Before the First World War, they had brought in conscription of a fairly limited sort of few months' training for all white males. That broke down because outbreak of the First World War, some of the Afrikaners connived and revolted and connived with the German invasion from Southwest Africa, so that conscription was dropped because you could, if they'd reintroduced it during the war. In the Second World War, the situation was much the same. So it relied on white volunteers, quite a few of whom were Afrikaans speaking, because it's not simply the British against the Afrikaners at all. It was a much more complicated situation than that. In the First World War, the South African government did recruit a Cape-coloured corps of people of mixed race from the Cape who were trained in weaponry, were given infantry training and served both in East Africa and also in Palestine. But the inter-war years, the sort of racial divides had become much more formalised. Although they recruited quite a few coloured people and black Africans into Second World War, they were not given any military arms training. The British, of course, British colonial soldiers were recruiting people in Kenya and Tanzania and Uganda and Nigeria and so on, and training them as almost entirely, not entirely, but mainly as infantry. And two West African and one East African divisions served in Burma. But the South African government, which of course was in the Second World War, was led by Jan Smuts, who of course in 1902 had been fighting against the British. He was not the most extreme, if you like, racist, but nonetheless the idea of giving weapons training to non-whites by 1939 was considered to be, much too dangerous.
It's curious that the pro-Nazi element in South Africa, suddenly reading that took me back to it's Ice Cold in Alex, isn't it? Although I think he's a German acting as a South African.
It was
Anthony Quayle.
Yes, who was supposedly a South African, but an Afrikaner, but he was a German. That's right. Yes. I don't know whether there is any sort of factual basis to that or not.
You mentioned recruitment in Africa, and I thought it was a great quote in the book, "The Forgotten Wing of the Forgotten Army," in reference to them being sent to into Burma. How were they recruited?
Or the black Africans, if you like.
Yeah, because presumably they're under direct control from London.
The British and indeed the French and the other European powers, once they had conquered their different bits of Africa, they started recruiting people from what they considered to be the martial tribes or the martial races. The same attitudes in India, that they sort of said, well, these sort of people are good fighters and those aren't. And the curious thing, of course, was that both in India and in Africa, it was often the people who had been the most recently conquered by the Europeans who, in fact, were the most warlike and were therefore very rapidly recruited. There's all sorts of reasons, but I think a significant element in recruiting African and Indian armies, whether in peace or war, was hunger. Hunger was always the great recruiter. You got regular pay, you got regular food, you got regular clothing, and so on. As it was, of course, in Ireland in the 19th century, and indeed in Scotland. But then, of course, you also had in India there was a strong bias in the British administration in favour of Muslims rather than Hindus, because Muslims were considered to be more warlike, and because they were mainly in northwest India, which is now Pakistan, they were indeed more warlike. But the most interesting change in the Indian army during the Second World War was that the demands of a modern army for mechanics, for people who understand who understood radio or who could be trained in these more advanced skills, were often townspeople eastern India from Madras, or Chennai as it now is. And often, so there's a great swing towards recruiting Hindus, who previously had been rather despised by the British as being, pacifist and so on. And the traditional people from Punjab or Northwest were less in demand because the army was needed new skills. And the same to a considerable extent, perhaps a less extent, but nonetheless importantly, in Africa. For example, the Kikuyu in Kenya, who were rather better educated than a lot of the local people. Therefore, they were perhaps less susceptible to discipline. They had to be recruited in the Second World War because they had the mechanical or had the literacy skills which some of the traditional fighting tribes didn't have. And you've got the same sort of thing to some extent in West Africa as well, in Nigeria. There was a very important social change came about as a result of that, both in India and in Africa.
And India, if we look at India, so the Indian army, the Indians didn't have to introduce conscription, did they? Or they didn't introduce conscription?
No. I mean, people were conscripted in Africa, were the white settlers in Rhodesia and in Kenya, for example. They were subject to in conscription, and so were young white men living in India, young Europeans. And they were normally, because they probably spoke one or more of the local languages, they were usually commissioned in the Indian or African armies as required. No, this is in Africa, though, there was conscription, or if you like, conscripted labour in Rhodesia and in parts of West Africa and in East Africa for works connected to the army, building, army barracks, for example, or defensive works or something like that. And labour was recruited, if you like, or conscripted for that. And apart from that, some of the Indians living in East Africa were conscripted into sort of rear echelon work in the army because they were literate in English and they could become clerks or radio operators and so on. There was no general conscription, except, of course, that the authorities would go to the elders of a particular tribe and say, we want 55 men or 500 men, and 500 men would appear. So there was informal conscription, very different in India. But it was never really formalised. So
the Indian Army, I think I'm right in saying, would become the largest volunteer army of the war with 2.5 million?
Yes, 2.5 million, yes.
Which is an incredible figure.
Well, it's always called to be the largest voluntary army, but with all these social and economic pressures, how voluntary were they? I mean, I think really the distinction between conscripts and volunteers is often very, very blurred. You got the same thing at the beginning of the First World War in Britain. There was a big rise in unemployment almost immediately after war broke out. All sorts of civilian jobs vanished. So a lot of people joined up because they needed the work. The distinction between volunteers and conscripts is often more theoretical than real.
In India, if you're only conscripting the white community, and presumably they will become the officer class, presumably they would run out of white recruits to officer the Indian Army at that size.
Oh yes, I mean, and a lot of British people were sent out as to officer the Indian Army, but they were rather looked down on by the regular British Indian Army people because anyway they didn't have the local languages, which inhibited and limited their effectiveness, and also they were often felt to be have unfortunate sort of egalitarian attitudes. They were imbued with the right sort of attitudes of the superior whites to the natives, even though if the word native was perhaps going out of use. I mean, the attitudes were still fairly firm amongst quite a lot of British in India. Not only was the Indian Army expanded to include far more Hindus, but it took in very large numbers of British officers from the UK, and also a lot of NCOs as technical armourers, mechanics, people from Remy and similar skilled corps which the Indian Army or the Indian population couldn't produce.
Did they also draw on their own for Indians as officers? Surely they must have been internally promoted.
Oh, yeah. Before the war, between the two wars, first of all, the Indian cadet scheme was a military academy was established, Dehra Dun, and also a few every year Indian officers were sent to UK for training. But it was a very slow business. There weren't, there wasn't a handful by the end of the 30s, only a handful of Indian commissioned officers. That was quite extensively extended during the war. But for political reasons, it was often very difficult to get Indians of, if you like, officer quality, because there was quite a resistance that why should they join an army and fight to defend the British Empire, which they wanted to get rid of. A lot of middle-class Indians were resistant to the idea of joining the army, which was considered.
It's incredible that their contribution to the war, certainly in numbers, is so huge. Yet the Western narrative of the war, we don't hear much about their contribution at all.
Well, I know in North Africa and in Italy, the Indians were extremely important, as they'd been, of course, very important in the First World War, in Mesopotamia and in Palestine against the Turks. In the Second World War, it was, of course, their main adversary, certainly in the second half of the war, was against the Japanese. And without the Indian army resisting the Japanese in Burma, I mean, the whole of India would have been probably overrun. The majority of the, if you like, the British commanded forces in Burma were Indian. As I mentioned, those three African divisions, which are even more overlooked, almost entirely disregarded.
I think it wasn't slim Indian Army.
Yes. Yeah.
I should have looked that up before I started. I thought it was. I mean, at the end of the book, you point out that Britain had the legal power to conscript 50 million more men than it actually did, which I was staggered by. I mean, I know the British Empire was big.
I thought put that in because, at the beginning of the war, all the colonial governments, and colonial doesn't mean India, or obviously Dominion in this, all the colonial governments, from British Honduras to Nigeria through to the Fiji, wherever in the South Pacific, they all came under an ordinance that, if necessary, the governors could request powers to enlist, to conscript. In fact, very few did. Malta, yes, because Malta, of course, spent 3 years under very, very direct attack from Germany and Italy. Bermuda also, although it was garrisoned by Canadians and British, it also had two local regiments, because it was, it would have been quite easy for half a dozen U-boats to land, sort of sabotage crews and destroy the communications, which are, of course, extremely important in Bermuda. Similar situation in Mauritius, where there was some conscription introduced, but a lot of Mauritians were employed in tail jobs in the British Army in the Middle East, because, again, they were often, very literate in English, and so they could, do clerical jobs or that sort of support services, which and freeing British UK forces for the front line. And some Mauritian conscripts were sent to Madagascar after the Allied, or the British and South Africans occupied it. It was Vichy French, of course, but there was risk of the Japanese invasion. I
think the best example you point out in the book of the British not really standing alone is Alamein, where there's, I think it's 4 UK divisions, 1 Australian, 2 Indian, 2 South African, 2 African, and the New Zealanders. And it's a perfect example of how we really didn't stand alone.
It doesn't mean to say that, as I mentioned, the New Zealand division was exclusively New Zealand. There were, as I mentioned, there were quite a lot of other, particularly in support service, British, Palestinian, both Muslims, Christians, and Jews, for example, Cypriots, and others who were doing these sort of real echelon jobs. So that just as in both world, certainly the First World War, the British in France were providing rear echelon jobs for the Canadians, Australians, certainly in the First World War, because the physical quality of so many of the British conscripts, particularly towards the end of the war, when they were dragging anybody in. They could do these rear echelon jobs and freeing these much healthier and fitter and Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders for the front line, where, of course, they suffered very high casualties.
Which is presumably why my great-grandfather was conscripted age 40. He was a horseman, and he was originally put in the Pioneer Corps and then became in the Labour Corps. So presumably at that age they thought he could be put to better use behind the lines.
Compared with in the First World War, you had, well, partly because of the nature of the war in France, but 70% of the British Army were infantry. Doesn't necessarily mean they're in the front line with a gun, but nonetheless they were in there in the infantry. Beginning of the Second World War, that was down to about 40%. It went up to 50% in 1940, when all these men were rushed into the army and could only be given infantry training. But the percentage of infantry fell off to about 30% by the end of the war. This was characteristic also, of course, of the American army as well. But, more and more heavy equipment came in. And, of course, the more and more heavy equipment you have, the more you have to have people concerned with, resupply of ammunition or resupply of petrol or whatever. And, of course, repairing armoured vehicles. So that the proportion of men in the teeth arms was falling, because increasingly the modern army of the time, and one saw this big change even in 4 or 5 years, required these skills, higher, greater mechanical skills.
Yeah, well, the Royal Army Service Corps ballooned during the Second World War. I have a feeling it was around 250,000 men in 44, 45. Certainly in Northwest Europe, when they were bringing all the supplies up from Normandy and into Belgium, it would have taken an enormous amount of manpower. I think, Roger, we'll leave it there. Thank you for talking to me. Volunteers and Pressed Men by Roger Broad is available now. I'll put a link on the website. It's worth a read. It certainly sheds some light and understanding on some of my own family history. So, to the big giveaway. I have a copy of the West Point History of World War II to give away. It's a sumptuous book with contributions from some excellent military historians, and the foreword is by Henry Kissinger. What I've decided to do is reward supporters of the show by putting their names in a hat. The name that comes out will get the book. Simple. To get your name in the hat, you have to have shown your support for the show by either Patreon or the support page and PayPal on the website. If you're an existing supporter, you don't have to do anything. If you want a chance to be in the draw, all is not lost. You have until the 28th of February 2017 to become a supporter, and I'll draw the name after that. I've no doubt the winner will be very pleased. It's a fabulous book. So that's patreon.com/WW2podcast or WW2podcast for other options on how you can show your support for the show. I think that's it for now. If you're expecting a look at the Rhine crossings in this episode, I've had a bit of a shuffle about. I seem to have had quite a lot come up, and I thought I'd slip it in probably in a month, maybe 2. We'll see. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.